Hey everyone, back this week with another episode. And I thought this week I'd focus on taking telephoto lenses or long distance shots and getting a really tack sharp photo, or at least as sharp as humanly possible given the equipment that you have. And that's the scenario that I ran into this week. So I was at a location, it's called Wing Air Chic Beach, I believe. It's on the North Shore of Boston. And I wanted to photograph the Annisquam, again, I'm terrible with names, Lighthouse, which is this lighthouse that's on private land, it's Coast Guard land, I believe. It's kind of hard to get close to, and there's a really nice vantage point from this beach. But here's the thing, the beach is about a mile away from the lighthouse, or maybe a little bit less than that. I looked on a map and it's somewhere between about 3,000 and 5,000 feet, so a little bit under a mile. And so in order to get this shot, I showed up at the beach at dusk, brought my tripod, I brought my telephoto lens, and I set up to take photos.
All right, so as you can see, the lighthouse is actually quite far away. All the way out there in the center screen. I'm using a Sigma 150 to 600 millimeter lens at 600, which is probably not the ideal in terms of sharpness, but it gets me this nice framing of the lighthouse. So it looks pretty good.
And what I realized in doing this was there was a bit of shake in the camera as I was looking through the live view and I was having trouble getting a sharp photo. And B, photography is all about problem solving. And that's really the bigger picture point that I wanted to make today. And I think that's why photography is actually pretty cool and interesting, is particularly landscape photography or photography outside, you never really know what the conditions are going to be like if it's the first time you're shooting a location. And as a result, you show up and more often than not, you engage in a series of problem solving steps to get the photo that you conceptualized in your head in real life, to actually realize that photo. First things first, I break it down to 4 different categories. The first category is the camera itself. The second category is the lens. The third category is the tripod, and the fourth category I just call other. But there's really only one thing in that category, so we'll call it shutter releases or external remote photography. Okay, so first thing is the camera. Now this is where you can make the most adjustments, and I found that I had the most opportunity to improve the sharpness of the photo. So the first thing I did was think about the exposure time. Now obviously if the shutter is open and you're taking a longer exposure, there's more opportunity for camera shake to infiltrate your photo. Now there's a caveat here. The interesting thing is that if you have one instance where there's one shake or one vibration, for example, a longer exposure can actually compensate for that. It can overcome that issue. And the reason why is because you're basically packing together a number of different time periods together into that one photo. And so if one of those time periods, say a millisecond, had a vibration, that won't affect the ultimate image that much because it will be overcompensated with by all the other time periods within that longer exposure. But in the case that you have ambient movement, for example, wind movement or vibrations on the ground or something like that, something that happens for a long period of time, in a situation like that, it's not going to be as helpful to have a longer exposure. In fact, the shorter the exposure possible will give you the sharpest photo. Now, I think most of us are familiar with ISO noise. In fact, in these videos that I'm showing you of the kind of experience overlaid with my voice, you see the noise kind of creep up as the night moved on because that's the ISO in my iPhone 11 Pro here is increasing in order to compensate for lower light conditions. So the more noise you get, the less sharp the photo will look to the eye. The third thing is the approach to focusing. Now I'm using for these photos live view, so I'm using the back of the camera. I'm not looking through the eyepiece. And there's a cool thing with live view that I think is kind of useful for landscape photography. If you push the plus or the minus button on your live view camera, or live view screen, depending on the camera model you have, you can zoom in on that screen to a small portion of the photo. And this is really helpful for focusing. You can really guarantee that you're focusing on the lighthouse in this case, or in this particular case, I'm focusing on the security camera on the lighthouse that's almost a mile away from my camera, which is pretty incredible that you're able to do that with the combination of the lens and the in-camera focusing technology. Another thing you can do in camera is move the mirror to a locked position. Now this is called different things in different camera bodies. In Nikon camera bodies like mine, it's silent live view, and there are two different modes. There's mode 1 and mode 2. And for landscape photography, in this case, I'm using mode 1 because it's more designed for kind of a stationary object. There are other modes like mode 2 that allows you to take faster frames. So it's really great for bird photography, for example. For the purposes of getting a sharp photo here, the reason why I'm doing that is because that physical movement of the camera mirror, of the mirror within the camera dropping down every time we want to take an exposure, which is, it's dropping down so that the sensor is able to capture the light that's coming into the camera. In that scenario, every time that physical movement happens, it does cause a little bit of shake within the camera. And so locking that mirror up or putting it in kind of this mode where you're not utilizing the mirror, it can be very effective at reducing camera shake within the camera. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was what we can do with the lens. And so there are only two items here that I could come up with. But the first one is to think very carefully about the right focal length for the particular photo. Now, most lenses are sharpest in the mid-range of the lens. So with a lens like this one, which is 150 millimeters at its widest angle its widest focal length, to the 600 millimeter, which is the tightest focal length, we have a pretty broad range. But while there's a tendency, because you're trying to capture this item that's really far away, in this case almost a mile away, to go all the way to the tightest photo we could get, the most zoomed in shot possible, 600 millimeters. The reason why I'm not doing that in this case, I'm doing 500 millimeters instead, is because at the very furthest zoom on a lens, or the furthest wide, it's typically not as sharp. And I found that if I go on this lens to about 500, I'm getting a really, zoomed in photo, but I'm doing it not quite pushing the lens beyond where it can do sharp photos. And I find that cropping that photo in post, as long as I don't need the biggest blow up print possible, cropping that in post to get the same frame, but to do it with a 500 millimeter focal length instead of a 600, is actually a sharper photo than if I were to zoom in further. And I know that's a little counterintuitive. You think if you zoom in as far as possible, you're going to get the sharpest photo possible. But if your lens is not able to resolve a really sharp photo at that furthest zoom, then you're not going to really get a sharp photo. There's nothing you can do about that. So I think backing it off to the sharpest focal length you can possibly go, the furthest, in this case zoomed in, that we can go without going past the capabilities of the lens, is a really important thing to do in this application. The other thing is turn off vibration reduction. I'm using a Sigma lens, it's called OS, optical stabilization. Turn it off. And I think optical stabilization and VR are wonderful things if you're doing handheld, but if you're doing something on a tripod and you really don't need those activated, and they can introduce a little bit of movement into your lens that you don't want. Okay, that's the things we can do on the lens. Now, speaking of the tripod, this is where there's a lot of opportunity. I do not have a good tripod. And the reason why is because I tried to save money. I tried to get a cheaper tripod, but I think that was probably a mistake. And I've heard this refrain many a time, and I think it's probably true. If you're into landscape photography, buy the most expensive tripod that you can afford. Or put differently, spend the most on the tripod that you can afford. And the reason why you do that is because if your tripod is crap and your tripod cannot handle your gear, it doesn't matter how nice your gear is or how thoughtful you are, if that tripod's moving, you're not going to get a very sharp photo. And so the way that I've dealt with that in this particular occasion is assessing kind of the situation. I've got the three legs, I've moved them as low as possible to the ground. I've tried to block the wind or whatever reasons their vibrations, in this case it's the wind, with a rock and my backpack. And even that wasn't doing quite enough. I was still getting a little bit of shake. And so what I did, which I don't recommend in all cases, but in this case when you have a stable rock bottom that you're kind of placing the tripod on, that it's totally immovable, it's possible to actually move this center kind of adjustable piece all the way down so it's touching the ground as a fourth element that's touching the ground. And I found that in this particular application, having that that center arm physically touching the ground with my camera on top of it actually reduced the shake significantly. Now the final thing I wanted to mention is sort of an additional category, and that's to use a shutter release, which is an external remote for your camera. It's actually pretty simple. It's literally just a wire attached to a button and it plugs into your camera. And I've seen a lot of landscape photographers use this. I always was kind of like, whatever, I can just use the built-in timer. But I gotta say, I do think that there are advantages to using the remote, and I do recommend doing it. And the reason why this is nice, and in this particular application, I became enamored with the idea of catching that revolving light of the lighthouse right when it was doing that little flash of brightness, right when it was perfectly aligned with me and my camera and I was getting that flash of brightness. I wanted to click the shutter and get that shot. And that's pretty hard to do if you're trying to time it with a built-in self timer. And so that's really the things that I did in this case. And the reason why I'm sharing that is because, first of all, I think it's important to kind of walk through why landscape photography is challenging, what makes it challenging, and how we can kind of solve those issues. And in this case, it's 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 different things that went through my head when I'm taking this photo of things I could do to try to get the sharpest photo possible. And that is a problem-solving exercise. And that is the other thing I wanted to share and really dwell on for a second, is that that's one of the things I love about photography, is it's problem solving. I mean, you end up in this scenario where you don't know what you're going to encounter. You don't know what the light's going to be like. The sunset might be crap, and so you're like, well, how do I get the best photo? Maybe it's moving to a new location that you've scouted. Maybe it's waiting because you think your subject is going to be interesting in blue hour. If you like this video, if it was helpful to you, please like the video. I really appreciate it. I'm trying to grow this channel. It's a very early stage for me, so it'd be great if you could do that. And also subscribe to the channel if you think this is helpful. And let me know if it'd be interesting to go into each of these things with a bit more detail. I know this is a long video, but there's a lot that goes into just executing on a single shot like this. And I would be happy to go into a little bit more of the detail on each of these subcomponents. It would be helpful. So that's what I got for you this week. I hope this is interesting, and I'll see you next week with another video. I think I'm going to do a bag review next week, so stay tuned for that. Take care and be well. Bye-bye.